She stormed in like a weather front, all thunder and accusation, the courtroom seeming for an instant to shrink around the trajectory of her anger. Her coat was still unbuttoned, hair escaping in a way that suggested she had spent no time on appearances because she believed appearances were the least of the problems anyone else had caused her. And the clutch of papers in her hand looked less like evidence than like talismans meant to prove the enormity of the wrongs done to her. From the back row, a child, probably 7 or 8, peered between an adult's knee and watched with wide, bewildered eyes, because children are built to register human storms and wonder why the sky has turned. She paced to the podium with a set jaw and a voice that began high and then built into a cadence of recrimination. Landlords who had ignored leaks that ruined her things, a contractor whose half-finished work had become a permanent hazard, a former friend who had borrowed money and forgotten her name, a manager who humiliated her in front of coworkers, a system that always seemed to require a miracle and never offered one, a bus that came late on the day her interview was scheduled, and a judge who had supposedly let others go free while her pleas had fallen into a bureaucratic sinkhole. Her fingers tapped a rhythm on the podium as if those were the only beats keeping her tethered to the world. Around the room, people shifted. Some of the murmurs were sympathetic, others impatient. A veteran clerk slid a notepad closed and watched the spectacle with practiced indifference, and beneath it all was the low, patient hum of a courthouse that had seen many versions of this scene. Grief and fury, navigating the same narrow doorway. She did not so much speak as unload. Clauses tumbled out. They did this. They left me. No one listened. And each clause was an arrow aimed outward. It was clear that she had rehearsed this not as testimony, but as a denouncement. Family members who turned their backs, neighbors who gossiped, bureaucrats who required forms which only functioned as obstacles, and a past packed with small, accumulated humiliations that had fused into a single molten resentment. Judge Caprio watched her from the bench, his posture a study in quiet readiness, his hands folded like a hinge ready to open. There was room in his face for compassion and skepticism at once, an expression learned through long practice in disentangling stories from the emotions they rode in on. When she paused, as if to catch her breath or to let the room absorb the litany, her eyes landed on him like a challenge. She wanted him to be thunder in return, a sounding board that would validate her fury and transform it into quick and decisive justice. Instead, he did what he always did. He breathed and asked a question that had nothing to do with denying her pain and everything to do with finding where the truth might live. "Tell me," he said, voice steady and gentle. "When you say they, which they do you mean right now? Who sat in your home the last time you were paid? Who cleaned the space where your child sleeps? Who put the food on the table yesterday?" The courtroom exhaled. You could see the air move as listeners leaned in. Her answers came as if measured by a scalpel, quick, precise, each one a dart. "No one," she said. "No one. My sister helps sometimes. The landlord pretends to care and then disappears. I have no money right now." The judge let those answers rest between them like stones on a river. She continued, the tempo now edged with pleading, because fury can turn into pleading when the world resists the expected punctuation. She spoke of sleepless nights, of a child's cough that worsened because the landlord hadn't fixed a damp wall, of the humiliation of being turned away from shelters, of applications that went unanswered, and of the particular private injury of being blamed for things she had been blamed for before, as if the world wanted to make her accountable for the injustice of being poor. Her voice cracked once, briefly, then hardened. She accused the court of indifference, of being an instrument of a system that punished the poor with its slowness and rewarded the well-connected with its speed. When she named names, it sounded like a recitation of grievances and not a narrative for judgment. The effect was to scatter the focus. Caprio watched closely, not disinterestedly, and waited until she had exhausted one loop of explanation, until the air in the courtroom buzzed with the static of too many accusations with too few specifics. And then he spoke in the way of people who have learned to keep a calm voice, because a calm voice reframes chaos. "I hear fury," he said, "and fury is often the right temperature for grief. But fury becomes a weapon against the self when it is aimed only outward. Help me understand one small thing. Who put the child to bed last night?" The question was simple, domestic, disorienting in its intimacy. She glared. The look was half anger, half bewilderment, as if the judge had asked about weather in a conversation about earthquakes. "I did," she snapped, as if the answer should be obvious. Caprio nodded, the motion near invisible. "And who, this morning, filled the forms for school? Who spoke to the teacher about the cough? When there was an issue at the bank, who called them?" Again, the answers were bare and telling. "I called. I went. I tried." The conversation was no longer a series of external indictments, but a revolving door that turned back on her. The mother in the back row, who had once stood with her neighbor in the grocery line and exchanged sympathetic looks, now squinted, trying to reconcile the portrait of external victimization with this evidence of agency, small, beleaguered, and beleaguered into invisibility. Caprio did not seek to shame. Shame is cheap and unquestioning. Instead, he exuded a kind of stern curiosity, bringing the spotlight not to her misfortunes, but to the relationship between action and consequence. You have been hurt, and you have also made some choices, as all of us do, in response to fear and shame. Saying the sentence out loud reframed the problem from being a cosmic accusation to a human equation, a set of variables that could be measured and changed if people were willing to do the work. Her eyes flashed. The anger did not evaporate, it never does instantly, but the armor around it showed a crack where humility could enter. The scene closed that day with the judge ordering a housing inspector to return in 48 hours, the landlord to appear for a hearing next week, and the municipal liaison to arrange a social worker to assist in completing paperwork. It was not a thunderbolt of justice, and it did not erase the history she carried, but it was a precise move toward resolution. As she left the room, shoulders still tight, there was a glint of something like dawning comprehension that the world had not simply taken everything from her. She had been negotiating an impossible landscape with the limited tools she possessed. Outside, the child clutched her hand and asked in a small voice if they would be okay. The woman answered, an honest, wavering yes, and the courthouse door closed behind them with a sound that was neither triumph nor defeat, but the beginning of a process.
Unfolded later, and began with the slow unwinding of the immediate crisis into the more complicated terrain of consequence and accountability. After the initial hearing, with its ordered inspections and appointments, there came a quieter, more grueling workday in which the woman had to attend meetings she had avoided, sign forms she did not fully understand, and receive offers of help that tasted of obligation and pity in equal measure. The files that Judge Caprio had asked for collected like a second language she had to learn. Intake forms with boxes to tick, release waivers that felt like giving away pieces of privacy, schedules for assistance that required an almost industrial level of punctuality she did not possess. Each act of compliance pulled on threads of her autonomy and made her wary, and yet each act was also a route out. The landlord, appearing in court with a lawyer and a ledger, folded his posture like a man who had been inconvenienced and was now affronted to find himself before an institution that required repair. He represented the small cruelties of bureaucracy, late notices that had been mailed but allegedly returned, vague promises of repair work that became a timeline of excuses, contractors who failed to show, materials that were backordered, workers whose payments had been delayed. In a dry, procedural tone, the landlord insisted he had acted within the law and that tenants bore responsibility for upkeep to some degree. His legal language was a shield, but records unearthed in the intervening days, the photographs Caprio had ordered, the social worker's notes, and text messages between the woman and the contractor began to nap away at the shield. The contractor, when subpoenaed, arrived with a cell phone full of missed calls and a story of financial strain and supply chain delays. He apologized at length and promised a schedule. The municipal liaison, whose office had finally matched the right person with the right file, explained the bureaucracy's failures not as malice, but as mismanagement compounded by underfunding. The "they" that the woman had used as an omnibus term for every wrong had splintered into people, documents, and decisions, each of which could be addressed in its own terms. This unspooling was not simple or satisfying. When responsibility is parceled, remedy is likewise parceled, and the woman found herself walking from one office to another, carrying copies of things that once were her only originals, and learning that recovery is often procedural and painfully pedestrian. Over weeks, there were small victories. A repair crew arrived and replaced a rotting beam, the school provided a tutor to catch the child up on missed work, and a local charity offered temporary grocery assistance. Each boon was laden with paperwork and oversight, and each required the woman's consistent presence, appointments she had never considered she could keep, signatures she had always feared to give. Caprio checked in, as judges sometimes do, not as a distant magistrate, but as someone who understood the limits of a single ruling when social systems are creaky. He asked for periodic reports, nudged agencies to coordinate, and reminded all parties that the purpose was not to assign blame theatrically, but to create conditions in which a person could rebuild. The woman sometimes complied with the process like someone navigating a foreign country with a phrasebook. Sometimes she resisted, refusing help that made her feel diminished. Those refusals produced their own consequences. An uncashed voucher expired, a scheduled workshop went unattended, a mediator's call went unanswered. Friends who had been peripheral in her life drifted in and out. Some offered rides, others offered stern counsel, and one friend, an old neighbor who had once been on the verge of moving away, returned with a bag of winter clothes and a blunt assessment that cut deeper than any legal opinion. "You keep telling everyone the world did this to you, but you're also closing the doors on the hands that want to help." It was a remark that landed like a pebble in a pool. The woman did not immediately change, but the pebble's ripples altered the pattern of her days. As the formal hearings progressed, Caprio insisted on an evidence-based approach, but also urged restorative measures, a mediation session between landlord and tenant focused on immediate repairs and a reasonable timetable, an agreement with the contractor that included a bond to ensure completion within 30 days, and the involvement of a social worker who would help the woman apply for longer-term housing assistance. The mediation room was a smaller, less public space than the courtroom, and its intimacy required a different kind of courage. In that room, she encountered the contractor face to face. He was tired, older than she had imagined, his hands rough from labor that often went unpaid promptly. He explained his cash flow problems without drama. She listened, and in listening, something shifted. She recognized the shared precariousness of people who do honest work but live within a system that often pays slowly. The landlord, who initially had a posture of entitlement, made pragmatic concessions when faced with credible evidence and the social cost of public proceedings. He agreed to a schedule for the repairs and to an escrow arrangement for part of the rent until work was completed. Those concessions were transactional, but necessary. The social worker, who brought experience and a fierce practicality, helped the woman break down tasks into manageable steps, one phone call on Tuesday, one form on Thursday, and taught her to set reminders on her phone, an apparently simple technology that became a scaffolding for reliability. Gradually, the woman's narrative began to gain new verbs, not only "they took," but "I did" and "we fixed." These verbs were small and awkward at first, but they were verbs nonetheless. Caprio's role in the unfolding was subtle. He would convene status calls, prod agencies when deadlines slipped, and at times he would speak to the woman in private with a candor that surprised her, telling her she had to be present and persistent, that the court could not repair every wrong, and that some healing required her willingness to be vulnerable in ways she had avoided. "Anger can be armor," he told her once, "not as a rebuke, but as an observation. And armor keeps you safe at first, but if we keep it on, we lose the ability to reach out." Those words were like a small map. The child improved as the damp was fixed, nights became less punctuated by coughing fits, and school attendance crept up. The woman learned the tedious arithmetic of appointments and deadlines, the necessary diligence of returning a call, the awkward humility of admitting you need help, and of accepting that help might come from imperfect sources. There were setbacks, a shipment delay for materials, a bureaucratic form lost in transit, a night when the woman drank too much in a moment of despair and missed an appointment. But setbacks do not erase progress. Rather, they illustrate the contour of recovery. By the time the final hearing on the repair order came before Caprio, the courtroom held a different tension. Less theatrical fury and more the quiet assessment of whether the ordered remedies had been meaningfully implemented. The landlord's lawyer produced invoices and a timeline. The contractor presented photos of completed work, and the social worker testified about the woman's improved engagement with services. Caprio listened and then rendered a verdict that was pragmatic. The landlord was held responsible for failing to repair the property in a timely manner and ordered to complete specified repairs under supervision, with financial penalties for non-compliance. The contractor was sanctioned with a requirement to provide proof of purchase of materials and a completion bond, and the municipal liaison was required to demonstrate a plan for improved response times in similar cases. He also admonished the woman gently. You have been wronged in many ways, and this court has recognized some of those wrongs. For the rest, your persistence, your presence, and your willingness to accept help will be the instruments of change. The admonishment was not punitive, it was a civic reality check, the maintenance of agency in a world that often wants to reduce people to their grievances. Outside the courthouse steps, she paused, the winter sun doing the small kindness of brightening the day. She looked different now, not because she had been absolved of pain, but because a new vocabulary of action, responsibility, and small accountability had entered her life. The child skipped ahead, light-footed, and she allowed herself a laugh that sounded rusty but real. Judge Caprio watched from the bench as she left, and there was no grand flourish, only the steady satisfaction of someone who knows that justice is often an accrual of small, stubborn acts that together make a life more bearable. The reality check he offered had neither been cruel nor simplistic. It had been an insistence that truth contains both the world's failures and our responses to them, and that only by facing both can the work of repair begin.